Hi guys, welcome back. Today we have a really interesting discussion. We're going to talk about everything from courtroom trials and Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan and the idea of evolution to the idea of kind of Christian fundamentalism and how it affects the America we know, all the way up to Prohibition and gangsters. Yeah, we're going to talk about Al Capone. In your notes, you need to add this title as Part 3, Social Movements of the 1920s, and believe it or not, this is, we got one more left after this. We'll be completely done with the 1920s, at least kind of our introduction to it. So one of the big areas, and we're going to review really quickly before we kind of dive in, but one of the big areas I want you to remember is this time is considered the Jazz Age. This is the time, the rise of jazz music, of popular culture, of kind of this live and let live, have a great, exuberant time. And last time we also talked about, this is also a time when women and African Americans really start to try to reaffirm and reassert their rights. And so for many African Americans, that means packing up your worldly belongings and moving to a new city to make a new life for yourself. For women, that maybe means changing your hairstyle and changing your clothing and really beginning to kind of become who you are and assert your dominance and your independence. Because remember, that's a big part of it. For centuries, women had been tied much more towards their husbands. Now these women are going to start saying, I don't need to conform to the same societal norms that my mother did, for instance. I can start to kind of branch out and do my own thing. So for many people, this time is characterized for as a couple of different things. If you might be on one side and say, this time was great, it's fantastic, I made lots of money, I lived it up and partied and had a great time, I had all this new technology. For other people, you might be disillusioned and think, society is an awful place and we've just come out of this war and we've slaughtered each other wholesale. And for some people who are particularly religious, this is a pretty scary time for them. They look around and they don't quite see the same world as they used to. And for a group known as Christian fundamentalists, it's a time where they really start to sit up and say, oh my gosh, what can we do to really fix society? And preachers in particular really start to reach out and say, how can we reshape and reform society? Much like the progressive movement, how can we have a kind of our own progressive movement for religion? One way is by having something called Prohibition. This had been bounced around for years. If you remember, all the way back into the days of slavery, the abolition movement was founded by African Americans and men, and mainly women, who were against slavery, but also who were in favor of something called temperance, right? The idea that you're going to eliminate alcohol. And this had been pushed around for years. In 1919, the 18th Amendment is finally passed. But the problem is it has a lot of unforeseen outcomes. One, the people who pass these laws aren't really going to follow them all that well. Most people will decry the evils of alcohol, yet will still consume it themselves and have private liquor stashes and private parties where alcohol flows freely. There's also pretty weak enforcement depending on how much money you have and your social status in society. If you are somebody who is at the bottom rung of society, if you're in the lower classes, you'll probably have a much stiffer fine or penalty if you are caught with alcohol. If you're somebody who is pretty wealthy and at the top and has a lot of political power, you're probably going to get away with having these parties. And you're actually probably going to invite most of the people who were openly against it themselves because you want to curry favor with them. Most saloons and bars are replaced with something called speakeasies, and these are kind of secret bars. If you've ever seen kind of an old gangster movie from this time period, most of them are characterized by need to know a password to get in, and a wall slides open and you can walk back through. Many of them are just hidden bars behind coffee shops or bookstores or restaurants. The idea is they had jazz music, they had smoking, they had drinking, they had live nightlife, and they were pretty popular, and they really become kind of to characterize this time period. The biggest thing about this is that it does for the first time starts to legislate something we call morality, right? This idea that government's going to get involved now, and for the first time, instead of maybe legislating regulations or how much money you should get paid, they're now going to start telling you how you can live your life, and they're going to legislate morality. They're going to legislate whether or not you can drink alcohol, and that's a pretty big and important idea from the 1920s. Is can the government really begin to tell you what you can and can't do in the privacy of your own home? Now, if you remember, I told you there's a lot of issues that come out about this, unforeseen ones. One of them, for instance, is that many people start to make homemade alcohol. And the problem with that is it's not regulated. We don't know how safe it is. People would make things like bathtub gin, or they would actually boil down wood and make wood grain alcohol. And wood grain alcohol actually has the same effect as formaldehyde, which we use in corpses and in science experiments to preserve them. And so it kind of embalms you from the inside out. Often you'd slip into a coma and you would not even realize you were dying and would just never wake up. We also have organized crime, because remember, somebody wants to buy this alcohol. If you can't buy it from the store, then you have to buy it on the black market. And so as a result, you get guys like Al Capone here in the picture. In the 1920s, Chicago, as a good example, had 500 murders that happened in Chicago based on rival gangs fighting for control of their turf. You had gangsters. Eventually, once Prohibition is repealed in the 1930s, many gangsters moved from alcohol to prostitution, to gambling, to drugs, to other forms of trafficking illegal goods, because the 1920s were wealthy for them, and they weren't ready to give up that power just yet. Now, one of the final things we're going to talk about today is kind of that idea of religious fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism, versus what's known as modernism at this time. And these are two competing forces. This is not to get people confused and make you think that modernists are atheists by any means, or that Christian fundamentalists are extremists. But this idea is that one group is going to oppose the other on how they interpret the Christian religion. And so for Christian fundamentalists, they're going to literally take the Bible word for word. They believe if it says thou shalt not do this or that, then you better not do it. And if you don't, or if you do it, then there's repercussions, maybe either social repercussions, political repercussions, or repercussions in your afterlife. They are opposed to one idea in particular, and that was Darwin's idea of evolution. Now, this is not necessarily saying that people evolve from apes. That is far from it. The idea of evolution from Darwin was that people legitimately, grow and change and develop over time. But for many people, they saw Darwin's connection to the primate world and humans and said, well, he's saying that we come from apes. And so that troubled a lot of people. And so that was one area in particular that they're pretty against. They push back hard. Now, on the other end, you have modernist Christians who believed that, they should really kind of adapt religion to kind of fit more modern scientific views. For instance, you might say, if you are a modernist Christian, well, I believe in evolution because I believe that God actually created our bodies to change and evolve over time. And so evolution is a natural thing that God had created for us, right? Many of these people were well educated, were often pretty wealthy, and tended to live more in cities, where Christian fundamentalists tended to live more in rural areas and in other parts of the country that didn't maybe have a lot of the same economic advantages. Now, this argument between evolution and modernism versus fundamentalism really comes to a head in 1925. A teacher by the name of John Scopes, who lives in Dayton, Tennessee, not actually that far away from my hometown, purposely taught his class about evolution. And it was Tennessee law at the time that teaching evolution was banned. He is brought on trial, and it's a trial that becomes known as the Scopes trial. And we get two individuals who are our lawyers. We get the prosecution by William Jennings Bryan. He's back again, right? Mr. Cross of Gold, Mr. Populist movement, right? And then on the other side, the defense defending John Scopes is Clarence Darrow. Now, these two men are rock stars, and this is a big deal at the time. And here's actually a photo of the two of them at this trial. Darrow on the left, William Jennings Bryan on the right. These two individuals really go at it head to head. One of the most climactic parts of the entire trial is that William Jennings Bryan is actually called to the stand, which almost would never happen. And Clarence Darrow kind of eats him for breakfast a little. John Scopes is eventually found guilty, but that's later overturned, and so that's neither here or there. But what it really does is Darrow kind of exposes Bryan and fundamentalists for having very narrow views and having kind of a very anti-science view. This pretty much puts a nail in the coffin of William Jennings Bryan. He will no longer be running for president. He's not going to be the rock star, famous person that he was before. What is interesting is that this trial is eventually written into a play called Inherit the Wind, and in the 1960s is put into a movie, and you can actually see it. It's a really good movie. If you get an opportunity, I think you should see it. It has Spencer Tracy in it, who is quite possibly one of our greatest actors of the 1950s and 60s. But this movement really begins to kind of fall apart, and you start to see this divide between urban America, people who live in the cities, right? The well-educated, often very wealthy, versus the poor, the fundamentalist society, right? Your rural society where typically people end up having more of an agricultural background, who maybe don't have as much education, and you start to see this divide opening up between our society, and that divide really still appears today for a lot of people. Next time we're going to talk about baseball and Amelia Earhart, the airplane, and NBC, for instance. And this is a great example of this. The radio and telecommunications. That's all next time. Until then, I do need you to make sure that you have all of this information in your notebook. Please come up with 2 essay questions. Oh my gosh, you should have plenty to talk about when it comes to fundamentalism and Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan reappearing again and the ideas of prohibition and gangsters. There's a lot here. We will talk about this a lot more in class when I see you next time. But until then, have a great rest of your day and take care. Bye-bye, everybody.